The Adventures of Tom Sawyer is a cute little platformer on the NES. You get to play as the highly racist Tom Sawyer, who is in school and falls asleep dreaming that his friend, well, I assume she's just a friend as he's far too young to be having anything other than friendly thoughts about girls, Becky, who has been kidnapped by an evil bastard Injun Joe. Because, you know, Injuns. So the game is based on the book of the same name by Mark Twain, a fact that I most definitely didn't get from Wikipedia, which, as I have obviously totally read the book, follows the plot exactly. The game itself is actually a solid one, and not the kind of solid that Tom apparently gets from this Becky tart. At first glance, it looks like it's going to be pretty terrible. The graphics of the game are quite basic with very little detail, and considering some of the other games at the time, seems quite lazy. And the animations are pretty minimal too, with just a few frames for each character. Also, the music is quite grating and short, meaning that it repeats very often, and it's so high pitched as well, it makes your ears want to bleed. It can get quite annoying. However, after a level or two of the game, you realise that it is actually a pretty fun little game. You run from left to right, as you do in all good platformers, through a variety of stages, including a large ship, a forest and a ghost house. There are also water rafting levels and flying levels where you get to ride a cloud and piss out gallstones. All of the levels have some pretty fun bosses to fight too, in the forms of giant animals usually, like rats, crocodiles, monkeys and octopuses. And of course at the end of the game you do get to fight the nefarious Injun Joe, who is of course an Indian riding a dinosaur. Why wouldn't he be? What are you talking about? Controlling Tom is smooth and he responds well, meaning that some of the tricky platform sections are overcome after a few tries, as you aren't ever battling to get Tom to do what you want him to. For a weapon, Tom throws rocks at his enemies, which are all themed to the levels that you are on, which is always a nice little touch, as some of these old games do tend to just reuse the same 5 enemies over and over again. Some of the enemies will drop items that you can collect for points and extra lives, and sometimes you get a slingshot too, which is an upgrade to your standard rock throwing capabilities. This is very welcome as the rocks are thrown in an arch, sometimes making it very hard to hit certain enemies if you're in a tight corridor. In some cases you can't hit some of the smaller enemies at all, which can get very frustrating if you haven't killed a specific enemy in order to get the slingshot. Something else to bear in mind is that this is one of those one-hit death games, so be sure to take your time and don't just try to run through the levels, as the enemies will be popping out of nowhere and own the buggery out of you, sending you back to the start of the level every time. Yep, that's right, this is also one of those send you back to the start of the level every time you die games. Overall, I was surprised by the game and how it is actually pretty good. It's a lot of fun. It can take a little while to learn the levels and it is very tough. And sure, yeah, starting at the beginning of the level each time you die can get annoying. But if you stick with it through all of the 6 levels, you'll find that it is actually a pretty good game. And it does play very well. You can definitely do worse than this on the NES.